right, well, just to recap last week, we were looking at the novel in Paris in the first half of the 19th century. And I wanted to really start looking at the novel from the time of the French Revolution to about the middle of the century. Now, just to sort of clarify this time, this is the time in Paris or in France which is called the period of the Restoration, which covers the period from the French Revolution, from Napoleon's reign, the return of the two Bourbon kings. There's a revolution of 1830, and then there is Louis Philippe, who comes to power, and then of course you have the Great Revolution of 1848, which will bring in Prince Napoleon Bonaparte, who in 3 years later will stage a coup d'etat and crown himself emperor. And so in 1851 the Second Empire will begin. So the Paris that we were looking at, the Paris of Hugo, of Eugène Sue and Balzac, was a dark, insalubrious, haunted place, as we pointed out. What the importance of Paris was that it was becoming an obsession for writers, and it had become very much the centre of France. And we talked about why, because of the deputies coming up for the revolution, economically, socially, culturally and politically, it began to dominate. But in the novels, it is still very much a backdrop, even though it is described in minute detail by all of those writers. It serves in many ways as a sort of metaphor for the journey of this new type of hero that we were talking about, the outlaw hero, someone who comes from, who has been pushed out of society for a trivial reason, has his own code of values, which are respectable in many ways, even though by society he's considered a criminal. This man continues his journey, often through difficult circumstances, to a form of redemption in many ways. So what you have with Paris is the dark, sort of fetid lanes and of course the sewers of Paris serve in many ways as this sort of metaphor of the journey of man, who is embodied by this hero, but man is seen basically as redeemable, someone in whom there is good. If these people are criminals, it's because they are victims of society, and you can see we saw that quite clearly in these three novels. Now, this was the kind of Paris that we were looking at, right? The Paris of Méran, haunted, dark, wet with tears. However, by 1900, we have a completely different Paris. Paris, city of light, literally studded with electric lights or gas lights, extraordinary buildings, extraordinary new features. If any of these writers had come back 20, 30 years later, after 1870, they wouldn't really have recognised it. But what is important here is not just that it's a different city, is that the whole notion of the city has changed. What we saw in the first half of the century was the old type of medieval city with different social connections where people related and lived their lives in a totally different way from what happens in the new city, which is the new urban metropolis, which is now seen as equally dangerous, but for different reasons. And what I'm going to be looking at, or the point I'm trying to make in this lecture, is that you go from a fetid, medieval, outmoded, cramped, dangerous type of city where disease is rampant, but in the modern city you have completely modern facilities, a new type of city, but the disease in many ways has been internalized by the characters. All right, so there's no longer outlaw characters. Everyone is affected by this. So what we're looking at in the second half of the 19th century is the way in which Paris itself, Paris as an urban metropolis, creates the characters, right, rather than being a backdrop which echoes the characters. Do you see what I mean? And we're going to see this very much in the work of Baudelaire, Zola, and finally in the work of Maupassant, where you will find all of these things coming together within a character who in many ways resembles Rastignac from Balzac, but is utterly unredeemable. All right? He goes from not so bad to being despicable and worse. All right? So there's a kind of inverse movement in the characters in proportion to the improvement of the city. All right, now what people are reacting, in many ways what the authors of the second half of the 19th century are reacting to is the loss or the total traumatic change that takes place during the time of the Second Empire. And particularly the poet Baudelaire is going to talk about this experience of change itself. All right? So this is this idea of loss and fear of the future. So I first of all want to establish what went on, what was this total change. And I'm aware that some of you have sat valiantly through many a lecture on this, and in fact perhaps one of the Bradburys would like to get up and give it for me. And I can go and have a cup of coffee. But I do need to do this because a lot of people here actually haven't. I think there must be one of you who hasn't actually looked at this. Well, in 1848, Prince Napoleon is elected as president of the Second Republic. Now, if ever there was an outlaw, it was he. He has spent all his life in exile. He has travelled from one country to the next seeking asylum, the ultimate asylum seeker. He was expelled, of course, the Bonapartes went from France, he went to America, he was in Italy, he is imprisoned also in Hamm in Germany and ends up for a considerable time, which is a very important time, in England. So he's polyglot, the first person to rule who speaks many languages. However, he's now this outlaw, literally, who comes back after many tries at a coup d'etat and finally establishes himself in the central position. However, of course, he is anything but a hero, or as we saw with the outlaw hero, someone who had extraordinary qualities. Either they were great sort of fluency in language or great strength or great charisma. Of course, what everyone complains about with Napoleon III is that he's a nobody, and in fact, this is what Victor Hugo spends his life in exile, during those 19 years in exile, writing vituperative poetry against Napoleon le Petit. There's even this majestic poem talking about Napoleon Bonaparte, and it's called expiation, in other words, revenge. And in fact, the revenge for poor old Napoleon I is he has such a nobody as his relative. And these wonderful poems about Waterloo and so on, they always end up, what's happened. So what has happened is that you now have a real outlaw in charge, but without the outlaw characteristics. Well, he's spent all his life in exile, and there are two things that he's going to make sure about. One, he's going to make the city secure, but in particular, when he was in exile in London, he was very much affected by medical ideas of the time. And in fact, this is what's going to inform the second half of the 19th century. Medicalised ideas about the city, medicalised ideas about disease, and about the beginning of psychology, the beginning of sociology, and how these things fit together. So this is what was called the hygienist movement, and this is the movement which talks about the essential elements of movement and light. You have to have air and light, and it works from the idea that smells produce illness. There is no germ theory with Pasteur that has not been invented. So they weren't far away. When there is a smell, it means there's something rotten, which means, of course, that there are bacteria, but they actually thought it was the smell itself. So you could get rid of the smell by having air circulating, and often bacteria, or what was producing the smell, of course, is killed by exposure to light. So there's this obsession with cities where you have the circulation of light, of air, symbolically of commerce and of ideas. I just wanted to very quickly show you this is what Paris looked like in 1580. You don't even have Le Pont Neuf at that stage. You have all these wooden bridges across which constantly burnt down, covered, of course, with buildings. Remember last week we were seeing how very small the Parvis of Notre Dame is. It now extends all that way here. Here, of course, you have the Hôtel Dieu, remember the hospital that we were talking about, and the hundreds, or not hundreds, but 20 or so small little chapels, which, of course, will all be pulled down. Now, as you can see, it's extraordinary dense living quarters, and this meant that there was no air, there was no circulation, there was a huge amount of excrement, which led to people dying something like 7 or 8 times more often in the central part of Paris than elsewhere. And this will be one of the major reasons behind the 1832 revolution, which is described in Les Miserables. There was a cholera epidemic in 1832, and the working class accused the bourgeoisie of poisoning them. Right, but it was a plot. So here we have images of miasmas and cholera, and they don't know what this virus is. They don't realise it's attached to water, and this is stalking Paris. And here you have the army trying to fire at this anomalous thing, which is which stalks the streets. So, as you know, Napoleon, who is still the prince, comes to Paris with a blueprint, literally with all of the boulevards worked out that he's going to develop, and all of the parts of Paris that he's going to get rid of. But being a man of extraordinary planning and capability, he puts Baron Haussmann in charge of this, and Haussmann goes about this methodically. Now, it's very interesting to note that neither Napoleon nor Haussmann were natives of Paris. Haussmann comes from Alsace, which means they had no sentimental or nostalgic relationship to the fabric of the city. Could a Parisian architect and engineer have done it? Quite possibly not. It would have meant too much to them. Whereas for these two men, it was just a city to be manipulated into this new idea of absolute modernity. So Haussmann systematically has a man called Marville, Charles Marville, who was a great photographer of the time, to record all the parts of the city that are going to be demolished. So we actually have at the town hall, there are marvellous volumes of every street. Now, the whole point of the demolition of Paris was to open the city up so that you have broad boulevards, that you have a city which is logically organised, where you have monuments are placed so that you realise exactly where you are. It's a very authoritarian city. Right, every place you are, you lift your head and you know where you are because of the monuments, which can be seen in a straight line or not. So this is very important. So when he asked Marville to show these streets that are going to be demolished, there has to be a justification for it. And so the streets are shot on a deliberate angle. All right. Now, first of all, this street actually goes around the corner. If you'd actually shot from over here, you would see that it went round the corner, but has been deliberately shot so that it looks as though it is completely blocked. You see that? There is no vista. It's a kind of a dead end. This is a dead end street. It has to go. The other thing that he's trying to emphasise is the insalubrious, unhygienic nature of this street. And so he always takes his shots either early in the morning when you get long shadows or at night when you get long shadows. So you can see these shadows here, makes it darker, spookier, something like the Méran etchings that we saw of Paris. He also takes his camera off centre, all right, so that it makes it look as though it's obscure and winding, and he also uses a very low vantage point so that you get the uneven road surface coming up at you. So it looks almost quite aggressive, this structure, not at all like the asphalt of the boulevards. There is no footpath, there is no drainage. It looks almost as though these buildings are going to touch. In actual fact, they don't. If you actually got far enough away, you would see that they actually stand up like that. But from a very low, close vantage point, the whole thing crowds in on you. It is a claustrophobic, outmoded version of the city. It has to go. This is what, of course, will be in its place, the broad boulevards with systematic facades, which are all the same, going off into light and air. All right, so these are the aspects. with circulation, all right, which is now the word in French for traffic, la circulation, right. Now, just very quickly, I want to have a look at what he actually does, because this is very important when we're talking about the novels of Zola. This was the only street which had begun in part by his uncle, the Rue de Rivoli. He extends it from east to west, so that you have the city is opened up from one side to another. He parallels it with the Boulevard Saint-Germain. He cuts it from north to south with the Boulevard de Sébastopol, de Strasbourg, sorry, which comes across to Boulevard Saint-Michel. And over here you have these round points. This is the Arc de Triomphe, where, as you can see, you have perfect symmetry, right? This idea of a city open, radiating, literally like a star. But of course, the more sinister background to it is that, of course, you'd have barracks stationed here, and if there's trouble over there, the barracks come in, whiz around there and off. There is an instantaneous reaction to any kind of revolutions. And you have to remember, you know, we've been talking about Les Miserables, which has the revolution of 1832. Who's heard of the revolution of 1832? You know, it was you have, good, right? Okay, it's a major one. But when you think of the revolutions, you think of what, 1830, 1840, 1870. There were constant minor revolutions that were going up. So this reconstruction was going to minimise the dangers of having the working classes being able to cluster together. Now, this went on for something like 20 years, and even after the death of Osman and the fall of the Second Empire, during the Belle Époque, Osmanisation continues, and in fact it even continues up in the next lecture we'll see, up until the night after the First World War, when they continue to expand the boulevard system and knock down little passageways. All right, so it's a blueprint for Paris. Now, this is a blueprint for a city which is going to be transported to the four corners of the world. You're going to get Buenos Aires, for example, is going to be based on Paris. Now, I've taken this passage from La Curée, The Kill, which is the story of a man, Saccard, who is based very likely on the character of the Baron Haussmann, in other words, the man who is going to mastermind the reconstruction of Paris. However, Saccard is shown as a particularly unpleasant person, just someone, an arriviste on the make, an outlaw in many ways, comes from the provinces, comes in, makes a pile, but as a particularly nasty, amoral character. And that's what you're going to get in the second half of the century. No one turns out very well. Anyway, let's have a look at what's happening, the description of this man who's going to make a fortune out of the reconstruction. And there's wonderful descriptions of Zola. So these gentlemen were his associates. These gentlemen set out to follow was in terrible condition. It had rained all night. The soggy ground had turned into a river of mud between crumbling buildings, following a line marked out on earth so soft that carts hauling rubble sank up to their axles. On either side stood sections of wall shattered by pickaxes. Tall buildings had been gutted so that their blanched entrails showed. Now notice the very emotive language. It's very much like someone killing an animal. Empty staircases and gaping rooms hung in the air like the smashed drawers of some huge, ugly bureau. Now, does this remind you of that description from The Mysteries of Paris? Do you remember in that first page, remember the man coming in and the wind whistling round the Hôtel de Ville? Not very different. It's still a vision, an unsettling vision. No sight could be sadder than the wallpaper in the bedrooms 5 or 6 stories up, yellow or blue squares now in tatters, marking the places under the roofs where poor wretched garrets had been, tiny holes that had once housed someone's entire existence. Ribbons of flue pipe, depressingly black in colour and with sharp elbows, climbed bare walls side by side. A forgotten weather vane made a grating sound as it rotated close to the edge of one roof, while half-detached gutters hung down like rags. And the chasm continued on to the ruins like a breach opened up by cannon fire. So this is an image of utter destruction, isn't it? I mean, all of the colours are dark and dank, there's mud, it's wet, people are sinking, human life, which is depicted by the empty little pieces of wallpaper, has been torn and it is insignificant in relation to this new development. The path of the roadway, still hard to make out, was filled with debris and marked by mounds of earth and deep puddles. On it went, but beneath grey skies, enveloped in a sinister cloud of falling plaster dust and lined by black ribbons of flue pipe, which were like the badges worn by mourners. Right, it's terrifically evocative of prose, but if you look at the colour and the metaphors that are used here, is this idea of mourning the past, mourning a whole way of living, which Zola, of course, this new way of living, Zola sees as being very, very negative. All right, remember that Zola is someone who is very critical of Napoleon III, just as Hugo and Sue were. So this is a photograph taken at the time which parallels that sort of destruction. Now, very, very briefly, who takes over this city? Well, we saw with in the Comédie Humaine with Balzac the beginning of a rise of the merchant class, and during the Restoration period you have the emergence of a bourgeoisie, but they're still small dealers. They're people who have made money out of little shops of selling spaghetti and so on. By now, under Napoleon III, because of the situation with the Industrial Revolution, but also his policies, you have now movers and shakers taking over. You've got bankers who are installing themselves. You have entrepreneurs, and this is the bourgeoisie who are going to dominate the city. So you now, the point I'm going to make is you do get a city divided in the centre between the wealthy and the poor from the middle of the Ile de la Cité have been pushed out. Their links and their ways of living have been destroyed so that they no longer form a cohesive group. They're all scattered throughout the outsides of Paris. Turning to begging, as you can see, Raffaelli is the great artist of this, this particular way of life. In the centre, what you get in the way of architecture, well, you have an architecture with extraordinarily showy material, marbles, gold, every possible type of inscription and style of architecture for these people to show off their wealth. Whereas on the outer boulevards, you have none of this. There are no lights, there is no asphalt, there are no footpaths with cafes, no majestic theatres where you can show your crinolines off. It's a desolate, desolate area, flat, with people eking out an existence in the shadow of the factories which are beginning to spring up. So these are real images of these desperately different types of Paris. There's none of the people living together more or less in the same parts as you had before. It also is going to affect very much other aspects of society that aren't just architectural, and one of them is women. And there are two great questions in the 19th century. One is the nature of women, what are you going to do with them, linked very much with the idea of degeneration, which was linked to medical ideas of the time. People were looking at ideas about heredity. Of course, we're looking at the origin of the species, which has been published, and this idea of evolution and what pushes it along and what doesn't, and indeed what is the role of women. So what you actually get, the solution at the time is that you have very pure women, as we've talked about in other lectures, the bourgeois woman who is kept in the interior space, the private spaces of the boudoir, where she is this pure angel of the hearth, whose main role is to be decorative, and that she is stuck between the indoor garden, which of course is very artificial. It's a garden which flowers outside the normal seasons. In other words, this is now a time when technology has turned the world or nature upside down. I think man is able to build places where nature is confused, right? And of course in this artificial garden you get this artificial woman with her corsets and so on. Meanwhile, out in the public spaces, of course, you get the other end of the evolutionary scale. The women who are prostitutes, who are more or less climbed out of their primeval mud, are very low on the evolutionary scale. All right. Now, the other thing which, of course, is very interesting, of great interest, is women's sexuality. You start getting the rise of gynecological novels, which are not novels but handbooks, which are novels, and particularly interest in lesbianism, and you will actually see this coming through in all of the three people we're looking at here. In other words, lesbianism was seen as this sign of depravity, this society which had gone completely upside down. You know, the usual thing that, you know, if you're a lesbian, it's probably because you haven't met the right man, you know, this sort of idea, and so they were going to fix it up. All right, the other great thing that you, problem that you have in this society is alcoholism. This is a syndrome which is recognised at this time of the development of the great new metropolis, and you get many images of this. Here you have a woman drinking beer, which is chic and alone. This is the real problem, women going out and drinking. Are they going to have smaller children? Are these fetuses all going to be alcoholic, mad, murderers, and so on? So all of these questions are very important, and they develop out of this structure of the city, with divisions of people into sort of morbid divisions, like those who are healthy are the wealthy middle class, and those who are unhealthy are the working class. This is the working class are dangerous, and when you actually have a wonderful mansion, you make sure you have 2 staircases so that you keep your servants away, because they will infect you. And in fact, even if you've got a nice dog, you don't want the servants touching them, because they might give the dog fleas. So, out of all of this comes a man, Charles Baudelaire, one of the great poets of the 19th century, who was a great aesthete, sort of a flaneur, but also an art critic, as well as a great poet who influences later works, such as Rimbaud. And he's also a translator. He translates Edgar Allan Poe. Now, when you think of Edgar Allan Poe's works, you know, the sort of the darkness and the sinister nature of his work, you can see the mentality. Now, Baudelaire was essentially trying to describe the experience of living in a city which is totally transformed. And he uses this power of memory to evoke the past, and his images of the past paralyze any vision of the future. Right? He resolutely will not accept this new city. So you have, out of this particular poem we're going to look at, this idea of alienation, isolation, melancholy, stasis, leading to images of depravity and Satanism even. But he dedicates many of his works out of the flowers of evil. I mean, just need to listen to the poems, The Flowers of Evil. He was taken to court for obscenity because of the things that he depicted in this, particularly scenes with lesbians and drugs. But also Spleen de Paris. Now, spleen, of course, spleen was recognised as being related to melancholy in the old system of humours. So whole poems looking at evil and looking at the downside of life. You don't smile much when you're reading Baudelaire. Now, he looks at people and he identifies himself, the poet, as a victim. And in fact, this particular poem, The Cime, the Swan, is dedicated to Andromache, right, who was the widow of Hector at the time of the Trojan War. All right, now Hector it gets a bit complicated by the time you've worked out the Bonapartes now, where it's suddenly at Troy. You've got Hector is killed by Achilles, and his wife Andromache is taken off into slavery with great lamenting. And so she is the sort of symbol of beauty despoiled, this idea of slavery, of the past which can never be regenerated. In other words, she's the victim of a city which has gone. Right? So it's very apt to have her as a dedicee for these poems about this disappearing city. And of course, it's about a swan. A swan, of course, it looks fantastic when it's on water, but when it's actually walking, it looks very, very awkward and can't walk with its big feet on another type of land. And so the swan also is the symbol of the outcast, the refugee, who no longer fits in, even with its great beauty, in a new environment. So he says here, Paris changes, but naught in my melancholy has stirred. New palaces, scaffolding, blocks of stone, old quarters, all become for me an allegory, and my dear memories are heavier than rocks. All right, so there's this idea of the past as weighing you down as well. You cannot proceed or progress in any way because of your past, and it is symbolised by the transformation of Paris itself. Now I want to read the rest of this from The Swan. Old Paris, where he describes where he saw the swan. Old Paris is no more. A town, alas, changes more quickly than a man's heart may change. Yet in my mind I can still see the booths, the heaps of bricks and rough-hewn capitals, the grass, the stones all overgrown with moss, the debris and the square-set heaps of tiles. There a menagerie was once outspread, and there I saw one morning at the hour when toil awakes beneath the cold dear sky, and the road roars up on the silent air, a swan who had escaped his cage and walked on the dry pavement with his webby feet. All right, so this is this outcast, this creature with whom the poet identifies. So that really is the first aspect of Baudelaire's works. I do advise you to read them. Poetry doesn't translate all that well as much as a novel, but you will get this feeling for this regret of the past. Now, of course, like many of the authors that we are looking at, of course, he's dying from syphilis. If you think of Maupassant, also suffers from third-degree syphilis, as does Manet as well. Now, this is, I just wanted to show you, why would you think, why is he talking about the Louvre, near the Pont du Carrousel? In fact, Napoleon III is going to build a third wing along the Seine, which is the Aile Napoleon, which is one of the three wings of the Louvre that you have today, and the Carousel Bridge is built to link it to both sides. So this is the Carousel Bridge here, all right? So this is the part of Paris that he's going to be talking about, this inner part. In fact, Baudelaire lives on the Ile de la Cité. Now, the other thing, and you've actually seen this before, this poem, but I had to use this because this talks about a whole other way of approaching the city. And this is the modernity, and it's Baudelaire who is actually going to coin the phrase la modernité. You know, what is the essence of modern life? And in his critiques of painters and in his salon writing, one of his famous books is called The Painting of Modern Life. Right? What is modernity? Well, let's have a look at this. This is the fact that it is dedicated to a passer-by. All right. This then is this idea that modernity is about fleeting moments. All right. The city has its past destroyed. You cannot even envisage a future in this rubble, and so life has been now pulled into rapid, fleeting encounters, visions, moments that you have to record. And this is what the flaneur, of course, is going to do. The flaneur is a man in the crowd, not a woman, because a woman unaccompanied would be probably a courtesan. So a man who absorbs images. He is totally anonymous. He has no relationship with anyone. You cannot build relationships in this new city. So the flaneur walks around absorbing images and then puts them down in either art or writing. And of course, when you think of Impressionist art, this is the exact parallel of this kind of vision, all right? Instant, a moment which can never be recreated, fleeting, going past, brushstrokes which are small, and so on. So it's une passante. In English, it elides the fact that it's to a woman, which is much more general. Right, the street around me roared with a deafening sound, all right? So the modern metropolis now is threatening. It's invading all the senses, all right? It's around me and it's roaring and it's a deafening sound. And in French it's hurler, which is a very strong word. Deafening actually is a bit dull. It doesn't quite give that sense of piercing over, completely taking it over you. And what does he see? Tall, slender, in heavy mourning, majestic grief, a woman passed, with a glittering hand raising, swinging the hem and flounces of her skirt, agile and graceful, her leg was like a statue's. All right, so suddenly, as you walk along, totally isolated in this anonymous space, alienated by the noise, there is a vision of someone which comes in out of left field for a moment, a twinkling of an eye. And it's a vision of beauty, all right? And so this is what Baudelaire is attempting to do, is to define a new notion of beauty in this second half of the 19th century. She's beautiful, but there's something worrying about her. There's this ambiguity. She's wearing mourning, right? But at the same time, she's got a glittering hand, which she shouldn't have if she's in true mourning. And she's waving the flounces of her dress in a very unmourning-like style, very coquettish, and in fact she's showing her leg. Now that's something that no woman would dare do. I mean, people had gloves, they had veils, their feet were covered. So showing her leg means that she's extremely flirtatious. So you've got this opposition between old traditions, ideals of mourning, and the new enticement, sensuality of the modern city. Tense, as is now, we now turn to the man, the poet. Tense, you know, he's not relaxed in the modern city. As in a delirium, I drank from her eyes pale sky where tempests germinate, the sweetness that enthralls and the pleasure that kills, all right? So any pleasure is seen as almost satanic, all right? It's going to kill you, literally. It's a lightning flash, all right? In other words, it's a vision which is so short that he's not sure that he's seen it, but it enlightens him. Then night, right? Light and then dark. Fleeting beauty, again, emphasis on passing, momentary experiences, fleeting beauty, all right? Important. By whose glance I was suddenly reborn, will I see you no more before eternity. So now you have the contrast between the fleetingness of the encounter, the nature, the ambiguity. You haven't even time to think about who she is, what she is, and it's suddenly going to be all gone, all right? So these old ideas of the time frames of eternity and time going on forever is suddenly completely torn apart by modernity. Elsewhere, he looks at time and looks at the way in which space and time have been completely dislocated. Elsewhere, where's elsewhere? Far, far from here. And he's actually started, the prose is getting quite hysterical, and you see how broken it up it is. Far from here, too late, never, perhaps, right? But instead of the smooth sounding of the first lines which meld into each other, you've now got this staccato, hysterical reaction. Never, nowhere, you know, where am I? For I know not where you fled. There's a whole lot of no's and nots here. I know not where you fled. I'm the subject. I know not you, and you know not where I go. So there's this reciprocity of people never being able to know each other in the modern city. Oh, you whom I would have loved, oh, you who knew it, but it doesn't matter. It's all gone anyhow. All right, so this then is the nature of this city, impersonal, alienating, and it's no chance that when Durkheim, about 20 years later, writes his first book on sociology, which is entitled On Suicide, one of the things that he emphasises is the alienation of the city and what is known as anomie. Here we have this idea of the flaneur, who we've spoken of before. Of course, the best one of the example of this is, of course, Manet. Well, I'd like now to get on to Émile Zola, who is the great novelist, more as parallel in the second half of the 19th century, parallels Balzac in the first half, and there is a great number of correspondences between them. Now, just to situate who Zola was, he was born outside of Paris, right in Aix-en-Provence, a school friend of Cézanne. He's going to live the first half of his life in Paris under the Second Empire when he was extremely poor, and he is a great agnostic, very much like Victor Hugo, and despises the church, and also despises everything about the Second Empire. The Second Empire actually brought the church back very much, and as the Empress Eugenie, of course, was a Spanish Catholic and was a great supporter of the Pope, and there were a number of political engagements that disastrous political engagements the Second Empire indulged in because of this push towards Catholicism. Also, the second half of his life lives in the Third Republic. He thinks is too conservative, and very like Victor Hugo, and also like Baudelaire, he's an art critic like Baudelaire, and a writer and a political activist. All right, he's not someone who simply sits in an ivory tower. He's someone who will probably be assassinated for his role in the Dreyfus affair. All right, so like Hugo, he also is going to struggle against social injustice. Now, I just wanted to locate him. Here, of course, he works very much, starts out as an art critic, working with the Impressionist movement. When you have a portrait of Manet with Renoir, Bazzi, and Monet over here, centre is, of course, Zola, a very important figure. However, he is someone who is very influenced by the scientific thoughts of the time. We've moved away from the historical novel, which is a series of adventures. We're now into a type of novel which is going to treat social issues, but which is going to treat them from a scientific point of view. And he has this idea that, as Baudelaire had, that the Third Republic, or the Second Empire, was a catastrophic time, that this civilization is threatened in many ways. And he says in the experimental novel, when a society starts to rot, and you look at the words that he uses, they're very much this idea of decomposition, of degeneration, and the society starts to rot and go off the track, the role of the observer and the thinker is to carefully note each new word. All right, see, again, medical ideas, and any unexpected turmoil. We are living on the ruins of a civilization. All right, it's not just, I don't like it. All right, our duty is to study these ruins carefully without fear or deception so as to unearth the elements of a better world. Science will be our guide. All right, now, he looks very much, this is a caricature of him saluting Balzac. Now, Balzac, of course, had already started this idea of a series of novels which looks at all of French society. Now, Zola is going to take up this idea of a kind of fresco of part of society, but he's going to limit it to one family. In one word, and he's talking about Balzac, his work wants to be the mirror of contemporary society. My work, mine, will be something else entirely. The scope will be narrower. I don't want to describe the contemporary society, but a single family, showing how the race is modified by the environment, all right? The importance of environment on the structure of the race, in other words, the French. My task is to be strictly naturalist, strictly physiologist, right? Now, the ideas that he's working from are several. He's going to be inspired by Balzac, but he's very inspired by a naturalist, a physiologist who was Dr. Claude Bernard, who is considered in many ways the founder of modern experimental medicine. And he writes a treatise on medical experimentation. And Zola reads this and uses this as the basis of his methodology for writing literature. All right? The idea is that you don't take authority, you question. All right? It's observation that counts. All right? So Zola goes out and stakes out all of the areas of Paris that he's going to write about, and takes copious notes, and reads the archives, interviews people. Or he's not going to take, in medicine, you have a theory. He's not going to take the theory, he's going to investigate it. He's not going, the other thing that Claude Bernard was interested in is that you can't take this idea of averages, you have to take exceptional cases and investigate exceptional cases. And indeed, that's what Zola is going to do in his novels and so forth. So he's a very, very important influence, and he's going to try and look at society or this family as though it were a scientific experiment. And he's going to put people in, different members of the family who have common problems in different environments, theoretically stand back and look at what happens, right? And this is very much this importance of heredity, which is the big buzzword in the medical field in the 19th century. And this is coming out also of the idea of evolution, that people adapt to their environment. All right. So what he does, and I know, look, a lot of you know this, but I just want to quickly point it out again. It's called the Rougon Macquart series, and so he goes from a common ancestor who is mad. And madness at this time can mean anything from alcoholism to schizophrenia to I don't know, what else could you possibly have? Epilepsy. I mean, it's a very broad word at the time. Anyhow, she's interned for madness. That her first husband was a shrewd peasant. And all of the people who descend from him up in this side, and you're going to get the people who come in, one that we'll look at, La Curée, and the descendant of his will also be Octave Muret, who is the person going to build the first shops. They have solid common sense coming out of the father, but this stroke of genius, the madness of the ancestor, makes many of them the wheelers and dealers of the Second Empire. One of them will become a great influential senator. Saccard will be the kind of Austrian figure, and here we get the fellow who starts the new shops. All right, and the environment that they all grow up in is a middle class Paris. All right, that Paris that we saw of the centre. Now, on the other side, before she actually goes into the madhouse, she has a lover who's Macquart, who is a murderer, who's violent and alcoholic. So on this side, you've got madness, alcoholism, and violence. And what happens to this side, as well as not subtle, he pushes them all into that working class, those areas outside the city of Paris, which had been were being incorporated at the time. So this disastrous environment, which is then going to bring out all of these hereditary features, and all of the characters know what's in them. They know, right? There's not much psychology. It's a bit like original sin, you know. They know that it's there, but they struggle all the way out of it, and they finally get to some point, and then it's the environment that causes the collapse, and it's downhill all the way. So all of these are disaster stories, much more interesting, by the way, than the ones on the other side. So here we have all of the novels written about different areas of Paris. Right? We're going to have La Curée, the Kill, which will be here. Down on the left bank we have the one about the shops, the Halles in the Marais. Nana is about the courtesan, is going to link both of these areas, and of course the wonderful Assommoir, about the life of ironing women and washerwomen who become prostitutes as well. I want to look in detail at La Curée. This is actually quite a long lecture, and I might actually go over a few minutes. Because there is an awful lot to say. Now, La Curée is an interesting title. It's a word for the kill, which follows the hunt. All right, when the meat has been distributed, the animals or the dogs are given the entrails, and this is a big sort of moment at the end of the hunt, and it's called La Curée. And of course, it symbolises the way in which Paris, under Haussmann, is going to be dug up and it is going to be thrown to the dogs. All right, so that's already in the title, and there's the idea of violence in it as well. Zola wanted this to be the equivalent in many ways of that statement that we had with Balzac, with the girl with the golden eyes. Remember, he says, what do they want? Remember that passage where there's all these contorted faces flickering, you know, what is Paris? It's just this place of avidity. What do they want? Gold and pleasure. Well, this is the gold and pleasure novel. These people who will sacrifice everything, all morality, all ties of fidelity, just for money and socials and success. And the characters that you have in it was Saccard, who was this sort of entrepreneur, his son by his first marriage, and the woman he marries, Renée, who really is the symbol of someone who is completely perverted by her environment. She ends up having an affair with her stepson, which is considered incest. But it's more than that. I mean, the stepson, Maxime, is shown to be a kind of very effeminate, half man, half woman creature, which is supposed to show that this civilization is collapsing. You no longer have different markers between the genders. And in fact, she dominates him, which is really a hinting at sort of that she's basically a lesbian underneath. In fact, you know, if you scratch any of these characters, there's something unhealthy going on. Anyway, you've got this extraordinary character, Renée. Now, I just wanted to sort of say that she, of course, is a hysterical person who will die eventually from some kind of mysterious illness of the brain. And this is really important. This is this point that I'm trying to make, that the illnesses which were just physical on the outside in old Paris now all come into the brain and into the psyche in the second half. And this is this interest that people had in watching hysterical women. This is Dr. Charcot and his famous Tuesdays, where he would exhibit these women and, you know, miraculously sort of show them by the click of a finger. They'd sort of go into different epileptic states and under hypnosis and so on. but everything was shown to have some kind of sexual basis. And of course you have Freud sitting there, one of the great disciples of Charcot. Now, this will take place here. Well, first of all, it starts out up here, and the place where they succeed will be around the Parc Monceau. Now, when Saccard first comes to Paris, I want to read just a couple of passages to you. He's an outsider, hasn't got any money, but he goes up to the top of Montmartre. And don't forget, at this time, there wouldn't have been, at the time of writing, Sacré-Cœur existed, but at the time of the book it didn't. All right, so he comes up and he looks at Paris, all right, and there's this vision of Paris as a jewel box that he can despoil, right? So they dined out on the top of a restaurant with a view over Paris, with windows that looked out over an ocean of blue-tinted roofs that filled the vast horizon with its surging swell. All right, so this beautiful impressionist prose matching his interest in impressionist painting. Their tables stood at the front of those windows. The sights of the roofs of Paris, always this idea of looking down, dominating, this man who dominates the structure of Paris. He's the man who's going to sort of put through the cuts and so on. He ordered a bottle of Burgundy to go with dessert. He smiled absent-mindedly and was more attentive to his wife than usual. That's always an unusual sign, isn't it? Right? But his eyes, like a lover's, kept being drawn back to the living, seething sea of rooftops, the deep rumble of the crowd beneath. All right, so this idea of Paris as a kind of living entity, which he already has an emotional involvement with. All right, so this is what the city has done. The hero, the main character's involvement is not with people or his wife, but with the city. It's the city that's important. The sun was setting, and this is really important now. These are these wonderful colours, all right? The sun was setting in a cloud of red, and as a light haze filled the background, a golden dust or dew fell on the city's right bank over towards the Madeleine and the Tuileries. Right, gold dust, all right? Why? Because this is where he is going to cut through his new boulevards, where he's going to sell it off and make a fortune in real estate. So these areas, of course, are symbolically covered in gold dust. It was like an enchanted spot in one of the cities of 1,001 nights, with emerald trees, sapphire roofs, and ruby weather vanes, all right? So the objects of architecture have become jewels, literally. He sees the structure of Paris in terms of what he is going to earn from it. Right? So this beautiful character. At one point, a ray of sunshine slipped its way beneath two clouds and cast such a glorious light on the houses below that they seemed to flare up and melt like a bar of gold in a crucible. All right, it is all gold, and of course, what melts in a crucible? It's the alchemist's crucible. So he is the alchemist, this man, this Osman who is going to turn the city into gold and cash. Oh, Saccard, Glenn Charles, 20-franc pieces are raining down on Paris. Angèle, too, began to laugh, remarking that those particular gold pieces weren't easy to pick up, which was fairly sort of, perhaps she did have to go. She was the first wife whom he gets rid of and marries René. From the high bourgeoisie. Angèle conveniently dies, probably poisoned by Saccard's sister. All right. It's a very good book. It's very hard to find. If you go into readings or anywhere, you can get all of the others, but never The Kill. And it's not even translated online, I noticed. You can order it through Amazon. It's really worth reading. So this is where, having made all of that money through Paris, through the reconstruction of Paris, not in a nice way, he lives around the Parc Monceau, which is in the 8th arrondissement here, going right down here to the Arc de Triomphe. The Bois de Boulogne is over here. All right, so this is the chic quarter of Paris. Now, I just want to give you one other passage. Now, the plot goes through the meanderings of the two lovers. In the end, the lover gets sick of his stepmother, and his father knows all about it anyhow. He doesn't mind because it keeps his wife out of his way. But anyway, in the meantime, you have these wonderful visions of the new Paris. And this is a very good example of how Paris seems to be made, or the new Paris seems to be simply an extension of the bourgeois homes. All right? So the lovers, René and Maxime, often dashed about the city by carriage, detouring down certain boulevards for which they had a special affection. Now, you notice the way this also is talking about a relationship between the city and the people. They've got affection for it, just the way Saqqara looked lovingly at the city, right? They took delight in the imposing houses with big carved doors and innumerable balconies emblazoned with names, signs and company insignia in big gold letters. As their coupés sped forth, okay, you get this idea of movement, you know, this idea of the new city which is open and whizzing past. It's like a kind of a panorama as you go through. As they sped along, they fondly gazed out on the grey strips of sidewalk, broad and interminable, with their benches, colourful columns and skinny trees. These are the boulevards with Haussmann's columns, Morris columns, the trees that have been planted and so on. The bright gap stretched all the way to the horizon, narrowing as it went and opening out into a patch of empty blue sky, this idea of the open city, city of light. And the uninterrupted rows of double big stores with clerks smiling at their customers, the bustling streams of pedestrians, all this filled them little by little with a sense of absolute and total satisfaction, a feeling of perfection as they viewed the life of the street. They even loved the jets from the watering nozzles that spewed white mist ahead of their horses, then fell in a fine shower beneath the wheels of their coupe, darkening the ground and raising a thin cloud of dust. They were constantly on the move. Do you see this movement, this idea of the dynamism of the new city? Constantly on the move, and to them it seemed as though their carriage rolled on a carpet along a straight and endless roadway that had been built expressly to allow them to avoid the dark side streets. All right, so this is the new Paris which has been built just for the bourgeoisie. They feel that they're just going out of their own corridor. Each boulevard became but another corridor of their house. The sun bathed the facades of the new buildings with joy, illuminating windows, warming the awnings of shops and cafes, and heating the asphalt beneath the feet of pedestrians rushing from one place to the next. And when they returned home, their heads spinning from the noisy spectacle of these interminable bazaars, they took delight in the Parc Monceau, which was like a floral strip essential for defining the edge of the new Paris and displaying its riches in those first warm days of spring. So here you have a vision of delight, very much like this view that you have of their coupe whizzing along the Champs-Élysées. And the opening chapters of the Curé is, again, people in carriages looking at each other, this whole idea of you only are who you seem to be, this idea of facades. All right, this is the house that he lives, the Meunier house on the Parc Monceau that Zola uses to describe the Saqqara's house, this idea of new, rich ostentatiousness and so on. Now, the exact opposite of this, if this was in the chic part of these boulevards, the inner boulevards that have been created, the outer boulevards are going to be featured in l'Assommoir. Now, l'Assommoir means a shop where you sell grog, and it's grog that's so strong that it knocks you out. Assommé is used as a word that you use when you're talking about felling animals at an abattoir, right? It means knocking you out. So it's a particularly strong one. Now, what we have here then is we're going down here, all right? We're up on the other side, parallel down here. We have Rougon Macquart, who is the so-called heroine or main character of this novel, which takes place just on the border line between Montmartre and the Ninth. Now, these outer arrondissements were absorbed in 1857, I think, by Haussmann, so that you get Greater Paris. These were little towns up until then. They are now. I think this is the Boulevard de Clichy. I think it is. Don't you think it? We have these a proliferation of paintings of little laundresses. This is how girls made their money, either as seamstresses, laundresses, or making flowers and so on, and possibly indulging in prostitution. Now, it's very important to look then at this. This is down here is the Ninth, right, and this is the wall, which was the wall that you can really just see it there. It was a wall that was pulled down, a tax wall that had been built. To get food and liquor in and out, you had to pay a tax. Napoleon III pulls this wall down, and in its place puts in the boulevard. So the Boulevard Rochechouart, Boulevard de la Chapelle, Boulevard de Clichy is the old wall, and in l'Assommoir, in the first chapter, you are at the moment when she's looking down at the wall that's being pulled down. And it takes place here, on the corner of the Boulevard Barbès and the Boulevard de la Chapelle. So it's just there, all right, and it still is just there. All right, now we're looking at her as she looks out the window. This is Gervaise, who's been up all night, and it has a sort of talent for attracting difficult men. And the first one, Lantier, has been out womanizing all night, and she's there with 2 children waiting for him. And she leans out her window at dawn, leaning over from the Paris, really, of the workers on the outskirts, over across the barrier to the real Paris on the inside of the wall. So she's almost like a foreigner in her own city. And she's watching what's going on. The hotel was situated, now you see how precise he is, right, on the Boulevard de la Chapelle, to the left of the Barrière Poissonnière. In other words, just where I showed you. If it was still there, we'd be able to see it. Now look at the description of it. It's like something out of the Mysteries of Paris. It was a building of 2 stories high, painted in a red of the colour of wine dregs, right, up to the 2nd floor, and with shutters all rotted by the rain. Over a lamp with starred panes of glass, one could manage to read between the 2 windows the words Hôtel Banqueur, kept by Mazouillet, painted in big yellow letters, several places of which the mouldering of the plaster had carried away. All right, so everything, it's like Balzac, you're going into, you haven't met her yet, but you see where she lives and you know that she is living on the edge, literally. The lamp preventing her seeing, Gervaise raised herself on tiptoe, still holding the handkerchief to her lips. She looked down to the right towards the Boulevard Rochechouart. We saw that there, right down to there, right to the right, to the Boulevard Rochechouart, where groups of butchers in aprons smeared with blood were hanging around in front of the slaughterhouses, all right? So on the right, images of death, okay? Then she looks to the left, and a fresh breeze wafted occasionally a stench of slaughtered beasts. Looking to the left, she scanned the long avenue that ended nearly in front of her, where the white mass of the Lariboisière Hospital was then in course of construction. What is a hospital? At the time, it was where you went to die. And there's another paragraph where death strolls through the corridors of the hospital. So she's surrounded by death on either side, on the outskirts of Paris. We know it's not going to be good. We then actually go back into an even better map of where she is. She would have been here and here. And there's this little street which is now Rue des Ilettes, and the Place de l'Assommoir is just here. All right, and she will set up, her relatives live in the Rue de la Goutte d'Or. All right, so she now looks from one side to another. Slowly, from one end of the horizon to another, she followed the tax wall, behind which she sometimes heard during the night time the shrieks of persons being murdered. And she certainly looked into the remote angles, the dark corners black with humidity, the filth, fearing to discern there Lantier's body stabbed to death. Well, again, images of horror, very like the Mysteries of Paris. Then she looked at the endless grey walls, a very different vision from that vision that we just saw that Saccard had. When he looks down, he's an entrepreneur who's going to make it, he sees gold. All she sees is murdered corpses, blood and grey. All right, surrounded by the city with this belt of desolation. Then she raised her eyes high and she became aware of a bright burst of sunlight. The dull hum of the city's awakening already filled the air. Craning her neck to look at the Poissonnière gate, she remained for a time watching the constant stream of men, horses and carts that flood down from the huts of Montmartre and La Chapelle, pouring between the 2 squat tax lodges. It was like a herd of plodding cattle, an endless throng widening by sudden stoppages into eddies that spilled off the sidewalks into the street, a steady procession of labourers on their way back to work with their tools. In other words, so this is a kind of species of troglodytes that every morning go into Paris to work and go back to their sort of shanties in the evening. So it's this idea of segregation that you had, but also you have to remember when she gets married, the wedding procession goes to the Louvre, and of course, everyone makes fun of these people in their second-hand clothes that are too tight and plodding through the Louvre, giggling at the naughty pictures. And so this idea is that this woman, a Parisian, is an outsider in her own city. This is what I want to show you what the Boulevard de la Chapelle looks like now. It's got the boulevard, the old-fashioned cabarets, the Moulin Rouge, and our hotels just along there. Rue de la Goutte d'Or, it doesn't look like that now. In fact, unfortunately, it's been marked as a neighbourhood that still has migrants or outsiders. And the mayor of Paris, who's very left-wing, Delanoë, put immense amount of money into bringing it up to date. And so unfortunately all the old buildings which were there something like 12 years ago are now gone. But you do get little pockets off here, the Villa Poissonnière, which was mentioned, which is still there. Now, it is all about, the Assommoir is about the horrors of alcoholism, related also to poverty, and how this is going to really be the end of civilization. This was at a time when the syndrome of alcoholism, which was brought into the fore. I might go on. I'm not sure that I'll actually... all right. The idea of alcoholism was very important because it was women now who were going out and drinking, and sort of they were going to produce these small babies which weren't going to be able to grow up and become soldiers and fight the Germans, who were looking very menacing across the border. But we have a wonderful description of the Assommoir. And Pierre Colombe's Assommoir stood at the corner of the Rue des Poissonnières and the Boulevard de Rochechouart. In other words, just down one block from where we saw. The sign bore the simple word spirits written in tall black letters right across it. There were some dusty oleanders growing in 2 half barrels at the entrance. The enormous counter with its rows of glasses, its water vat, its pewter measures stretched along to the left of the entrance. The vast room was decorated all round with huge casts painted pale yellow. All right, I just wanted to show you this image that you have of the Bar Folie Bergère, which could in many ways be that image that you had there. Now, the important part here is the real attraction of the place, standing beyond an oak balustrade in the glassed-in rear courtyard, was a still, which the customers could see working with its long-necked alembics and its tubes coiling down to the ground, a veritable devil's kitchen in front of which boozing workmen would hang out and daydream. So here you have this idea, this sort of allegory of drink, which is going to take over the working classes, just the way you had that sort of allegory of alchemy, which was going to enrich the bourgeoisie. So here you've got this kind of creature that's sort of ready, sort of secreting alcohol, and this is going to be sort of the end of a whole part of the civilization of Paris. All right, now just very quickly, going back ahead into the family, I just very quickly want to read you a passage. We're now looking at Gervaise's children, all right? Lantier, who will become a mad artist. It's called The Masterpiece, and Cézanne feels that it's he, so he no longer speaks to Zola. Here we have Jacques Lantier, who we're going to talk about in a minute, who is a railroad man and is a murderer, particularly murders women. Etienne Lantier is a trade union official. And I won't go into that. Anna Coupé will become Nana, the great courtesan. I'll have a look at that. All right, so where we're looking at here is going to be around the Gare Saint-Lazare. You notice that all of these ones on the downside of Paris are here, in this area here. All right, so this is the 9th arrondissement. Here is the Gare Saint-Lazare, just on the border between the 8th and the 9th. This is what it looks like when you look down from the Pont d'Europe. And this is the passage, one of the first opening pages of The Human Beast, and he was a beast. All right, opposite him, beneath the powdery rays of the sun, the houses of the Rue de Rome blurred into nothing, mere insubstantial shapes. Very impressionist, isn't it? All right, you've got under the sun, everything becomes blurred and melts, all right? To his left, the glass roofs spanned the station concourses like giant porches. Then panes blackened with smoke, and the eye plunged into the huge mainline shed that was separated by the buildings of the mail and the foot-warmer depots from the other smaller sheds of the Argenteuil, Versailles and Saint-Cyr lines, while to the right the iron star that was the Pont d'Europe cut across the open space, which reappeared beyond it only to vanish in the distance in the direction of the Batignolles tunnel. I won't go on, but this goes through underneath. And of course this is going to be painted by Monet. Time and time again, about 7, I think, or 8 times. He comes and gets the station master to stop the trains and to make the smoke billow. So he gets this effect of light, making everything disintegrate. Now, I want to look at his sister in particular, Nana, whose name was Anne, who is the last or the youngest of this family. Now, what had happened to Gervaise, unfortunately, going back to the Assommoir, she struggled to bring up 2 children by herself. managed to set herself up as a laundress. Things are going well, marries the second fellow who's a plumber, but also who has a heredity of drink, and he of course topples off a roof and can't work anymore. So she's supporting him and his drink habit. And at the height of her life, she has a communion feast, enormous feast, symbolic of course, the Last Supper, for her daughter Anna, who already is showing signs of being a real little number. And it's at this time, at that night, that there's someone at the window, and who should it be? It's the first husband who's come back. And the second husband, being a nice drunk, invites him in. They form an inseparable couple, and together they use up all of the money that Paul Gervais is trying to put together. In the end, she collapses under the burden and will die in appalling circumstances. Meanwhile, Nana has seen this depraved, this is the whole point of Zola's work, this depraved life, and decides she'll set herself up as a courtesan. Now she starts out in a wonderful chapter on the theatre, where she appears and entrances men just by being naked on the stage. She can't sing, she can't act, but she has no clothes on, but that's the main point. She looks damn good. So she is, of course, going to be the inspiration of this painting by Manet. Here we have Nana, who is actually based on two women. One of them is a woman who is called Citron, who was Blanche d'Albigny, and Voltaire de Labigne also. So Zola not only uses real landscapes for his imaginary landscapes in the novels, but also he bases his characters on real people. Now, the important thing about Nana is that she's going to start on the outskirts of Paris at Montmartre and gradually make her way as a courtesan through to the highest places, most chic areas of Paris. So the point that Zola is trying to make, it is only through vice that you are going to rise in society. But there's also more to it. He uses Nana as this sort of symbol of the revenge of the working class against the bourgeoisie, and he calls her the golden fly because she has this beautiful Titian red hair, which she flaunts all the time. And this golden fly is going to rot the middle classes. So her lover, Muffat, who is a sort of hopeless little degenerate aristocrat, is going to sort of give away his daughter's dowry. He gives away all respectability, totally enslaved by the power, animal sort of instinctual power of Nana. So Mrs. Paul Muffat, I don't know what his wife was doing at the time, but he seems to spend an awful lot of time, I don't know what the excuse was, I'm going out to get a baguette or something. Anyway, Muffat was reading slowly Fauchery's article entitled The Golden Fly, describing, of course, this is what Zola has set her up. She's the fourth generation of this degenerate family, all right? Describing the life of a harlot, descended from 4 or 5 generations of drunkards and tainted in her blood by a cumulative inheritance of misery and drink, which in her case had taken the form of nervous exaggeration of sexual instinct. If you're a woman and if you're interested in sex, it must mean that it's some kind of mental degeneration. This is the only explanation, because respectable women weren't interested in that. They were only interested in becoming mothers. But also this idea of sexual instinct was also a perverted one, because Nana also is shown to be a lesbian. So just the way we had, and that's why she can manipulate men, because she has no feelings for them. All right, so she has shot up into womanhood in the slums, and this is this wonderful image of her as a kind of a plant. Up to womanhood in the slums, on the pavements of Paris, a tall, handsome, and as superbly grown as a dunghill plant. She avenges the beggars and outcasts of whom she is the ultimate product. All right, it's a very sort of, Darwinian look at this, isn't it? With her, the rottenness that is allowed to ferment amongst the populace is carried upward and rots the aristocracy. Right? These extraordinary, these images of decay and you can smell the whole thing, all right? She becomes a blind power of nature, a leaven of destruction, and unwittingly she corrupts and disorganises all Paris, churning it between her snow-white thighs. All right?
This is the book I've just given Gordon. I hope he's going to enjoy it. You might see a remarked reaction to it. And it was at the end of this article that a comparison with a fly occurred, a fly of sunny hue which has flown up out of the dung, a fly which sucks in death on the carrion tolerated by the roadside, and then buzzing, dancing and glittering like a precious stone, enters the windows of palaces and poisons the men within by merely settling on them in her flight. Isn't it wonderful? So again, this dark and light, but here she's seen as this corrupt, and she dies in the most appalling way where her body rots in the end, but I won't tell you. All right, so that's where she comes from. She started out her career in the Théâtre des Variétés, which is on the Boulevard Montmartre, which is still there. And there's whole passages where she talks about she loves the Passage des Panoramas, she loves the cheap gimcrack stuff that you can buy there, mind you, so do I. But anyway, now, I just want, look, I find this lecture so hard to compose because I have to constantly stop it, you can't put any more in, stop it. All right, so just quickly, on December evening, 3 months after Comte Muffat was strolling in the Passage des Panoramas, the evening was mild and owing to the passing shower, the passage has become too crowded with people. There was a perfect mob of them and they thronged slowly and laboriously along between the shops on either side. Under the window, white with reflected light, the pavement was violently illuminated. A perfect stream of brilliancy emanated from the white globes, red lanterns, blue transparencies, lines of gas jets, gigantic watches and fans outlined in flame and burning in the open. Look, it goes on, but this is very much as to what it still looks like today, is what I'm trying to say. Oh, that's another quotation. I had to do it. All right, the other thing that's very important in Nana is the fact that through the courtesans, everything is turned upside down. No one can really discern, particularly with the rise of the great shops, when everyone can afford the same sorts of clothes, and courtesans are so rich that they can afford the great couturiers such as Worth. It's impossible really to know who is who. And so you get this fascination between vice and virtue. There's no longer in this city, this modern metropolis, there's no longer any demarcation between the two of them. So the great ladies are going to watch Nana, and the courtesans are going to watch the great ladies. In fact, at the funeral of a well-known real courtesan, Marie Duplessis, who's the heroine of La Traviata, all of society's ladies turn up at the auction to see what her dresses and what she had. What was it that was so fascinating? So I just read a little bit of this. Thereupon Nana, who's this hopeless case, who has this strange career, hopeless actress, hopeless anything, she's been launched. And so everyone wants her to be their lover, not because she's so fantastic, or maybe she was, but the fact is that she's so expensive. And to be able to pay yourself the most expensive courtesan was the ultimate show of affluent living. Thereupon Nana became a woman of fashion, a beneficiary of male stupidity and lust, an aristocrat in the ranks of her calling. Her success was sudden and decisive, a swift rise to gallant fame in the garish light of lunatic extravagance and the wasteless follies of beauty. She at once became queen amongst the most expensive of her kind. Her photographs were displayed in shop windows, her remarks were quoted in the papers. When she drove along the boulevards in her carriage, people would turn round and tell one another who she was, with all the emotion of a nation saluting its sovereign, while she lolled back in her flimsy dresses. And then I just go down to the bottom. She set this last sentence here, she had the supple grace of a serpent, a studied yet seemingly involuntary carelessness of dress which was exquisitely elegant, the nervous distinction of a pedigree cat, an aristocratic refinement, proudly and rebelliously tramping Paris underfoot like an all-powerful mistress. She set the fashion, the great ladies imitated her. All right, so this is society upside down. And this is actually, you can't see her house anymore. Oh, that's right, the last thing was, Nana's house was in the Avenue de Villiers on the corner of the Rue Cardinet in the luxurious quarter which was springing up on the waste ground that had once been the Monceau plain. You can't see that anymore, but you can on the Champs-Élysées see the house of one of the great courtesans, La Paiva, which is, I won't have time to talk about. On the left bank you have another story, which is the development of the great shops. Here we have with Zola dying, possibly assassinated for his involvement in the Dreyfus affair when he comes back from exile. As he says, civilization will not attain to its perfection until the last stone from the last church falls on the last. So look, I'm very sorry. I had some Sacré-Cœur girls in the audience yesterday, and I wasn't sure that they took it the right way. But I've left myself very, very little time to talk of Maupassant, so I probably will go over 5 minutes if that's all right with you. All right, now Guy de Maupassant was much younger than Zola. Zola, by the time he'd finished writing his cycle of 20 books, was a celebrity. He had enough money to live at Medan, and there he had a circle which was called the Siècle de Medan, and he welcomed young writers. And one of the young writers who comes to work with him or sits at his feet is Maupassant. And Zola sees his incredible talent and encourages him to write. And his first novel will be about, of course, a prostitute called Boule de Suif, Suet Lump, which is an instant bestseller. And he goes on from there. Maupassant will write hundreds and hundreds, particularly, of short stories, all of which have a nasty, cynical twist to it. By now you've got these utterly cynical characters who have replaced the outlaw hero. Now, what is interesting, many very things that are very interesting about him, but he developed syphilis very early, and I think he's going to die when he's in his early 40s, which means that even when he's writing in his 30s, he's plagued by appalling migraines and a gradual descent into insanity and mental illness. And he actually writes a novel about this experience, just the way Baudelaire wrote about the experience of the disintegration of the city. We're now getting writers looking at the disintegration of the mind. And Le Hors-là is where he can constantly, there's another Maupassant out there talking at him all the time. There's voices, which not just voices from outside his head, but they are himself speaking to him. And he's written a very interesting novel about that. The one that he is most known for is called Bel Ami, or in English it's translated as The Scoundrel, which does give a different slant to things, doesn't it? It's really interesting. It's the story of Georges Duroy, who's a sort of very good-looking, out-of-pocket young man who's been discharged from the army, got a terribly lowly job on the railways. In fact, he can't help himself. He's always spending his last few bob on prostitutes or drinks, and by total chance, as he's wandering along one of the outer boulevards, and this is really significant because he's going to go a journey which will lead him along to the inner boulevards, right up to the Madeleine Church, which of course is the centre of, posh society. So he, by chance, meets a former comrade in arms who has become a journalist and invites him for dinner. Well, that is the beginning of his career, and he works by seducing women, and it's a very cynical take on the society of not the Second Empire but now the Third Republic, which comes into place in 1870 after the defeat of Napoleon III at the Franco-Prussian War. So the Third Republic is conservative, but it's also racked by appalling scandals to do with bankers, and a lot to do with Jewish bankers as well, which is what is going to bring about this whole ghastly Dreyfus affair, this Panama scandal and so on. So he's writing about a society which is totally corrupt, from politically, economically and morally. And as we see this character gradually progress, he gets more and more corrupt as he goes on. So in many ways he's like a Rastignac figure, remember in the Comédie Humaine in Old Goriot, who starts out as a very idealistic young student, but through his experiences ends, at the very end of the book, knows that he has to become cunning and unscrupulous. This is the only way to exist. At the beginning of this novel, Duroy has started out cunning, and in the end he stoops to the most appalling things just to get money and fame, and it is never enough. It will go on and on. So he seduces the wife of the person who helped him get a job. She is actually a journalist herself, but can't publish because she's a woman, so she writes his articles and he publishes them, and he becomes known to his boss. He seduces the boss's wife, and then that's not quite enough. It seduces numerous other people, is set up by other women, set up by bourgeois women, given money by bourgeois women, until he actually earns enough and decides he's going to really arrive in society. So instead of being Georges du Roi, he's now Georges du Roi, and then he adds on to the place where he used to live, Georges du Roi de Cantal. It's like me saying Sylvia de Sagona de Drummond Street or something like that. And then, of course, he puts Baron in the front of it. And so this is extraordinary title. And finally, after all these women are in love with him, his boss's wife is virtually going to kill to keep him. She sells secrets of different trades that are going on in Algeria and so on, and so Duroy makes a fortune out of that. He decides he's got money, he's got position, but he needs social cachet. How can I get it? He'll marry the daughter of his boss and his mistress, all right? So the poor mistress has to assist at the wedding, and the boss has to give over this massive dowry for this young girl. And in the last, I won't go into it, it's a satire on the press, because all of them are people who work in the press. You'll recognise this Rue Lafitte with Notre Dame de Lorette and Sacré-Cœur in the background. He comes to the Madeleine Church, and this is, as you can see in Béraud's painting here, where the who's who of Paris go to worship, all right? And in this last sort of image of Bel-Ami, who is cynically risen to the heights, he comes out on the top of the steps up here with his young wife, and all of Paris is there, just black heads. All of the press, who he has now risen through, are there. He's been given a Legion of Honour. He's got this lovely young wife, absolute, sounds like Lance Armstrong in reverse, and he has conquered society completely in a way that Rastignac never could have. So I think this is a very important point to make, that we now have a totally cynical hero. There is no longer any sense of the redemption of man through any voyage of consciousness. One simply wants more wealth, more distinction, and you keep going until you get the highest spot of all. And who knows, it might be the next Prime Minister. Now, what has really happened then in this... I've forgotten, but I've got a whole extra bit. Have I got time to do this? Oh, look, I just very quickly want to show that he also goes outside Paris and, and goes to one of his ganguettes outside Paris where Renoir is painted. This is what it looks like now. And goes to La Grenouillère, which is the prostitute's hole. People used to go out on the trains and go out once a week and come back. Everyone used to bathe. It was known as being quite a debauched place. It's painted by Monet, it's painted by Renoir, and it is in one of his short stories there is a description of this area. Now Maupassant himself was quite a solitary character. I mean, he was struggling with all these mental issues, and he used to live at the Ministry of Justice as a clerk, and at night he'd row down the river to Chateau. And he knew intimately La Fournaise. He used to stay there. Well, he wrote a story called Paul's Girl, which is about some poor young clerk who takes a girl out who's actually a lesbian and who runs off with two lesbian women at the time. But I want to give you this vision of the way in which it's described. They turned round the elbow of the river. La Grenouillère appeared to them in the distance. The establishment en fait was decorated with sconces with coloured garlands draped in clusters of light. Can you see that there? Right, I'm going to leave that. So there's the orchestra which is playing, and his girlfriend runs into the fray. And there's now this description of people dancing. I just want to look at this. They dance, the couples opposite each other, capered in the most distracted manner, throwing their legs in the air until they are upon a level with the noses of their partners. The women, whose thighs were disjointed, skipped amid such a flying upwards of their petticoats that the lower portion of their frames were displayed. They kicked their feet above their heads with astounding facility and balanced their bodies, wagged their backs and shook their sides, shedding around them a powerful scent of sweating womanhood. The men were squatting like toads, some making obscene signs, some turned and twisted themselves, grimacing and hideous, some turned like a wheel on their hands, or perhaps trying to make themselves funny, sketched the manners of the day with exaggerated gracefulness. Now, I want to, that is the last quotation that you will be getting today. I wanted to liken that to, again, that vision we had of Balzac's Paris, which was like one of Dante's levels of hell. Do you remember that, with people with masks, grimacing, there were light and shade and red, and then also the passage I read to you about Hugo's Cour des Miracles. Remember where in the 15th century all the brigands would go into that area and pull off their bandages? Do you remember that vision where you couldn't tell who nationalities, you couldn't tell gender, you couldn't tell anything? It was this massive seething shadows. This is, 50 years later being written, and it's not actually much similar, this grotesque nature of the bestiality in people. So coupled with his vision of this sort of bestiality, which in many ways I think is quite interesting with this poster of Toulouse-Lautrec, these shadows of this strange contorted dancing where all elegance and refinement has been left behind, and women of course are no longer sort of, still they're showing energy and sexuality, which is something which was seen by Zola, of course, as really the end of civilization. So what you have then, by the end of the century, is a beautiful city, but it's completely different from the city we saw at the beginning in last week's lecture. It's not just you've got a few more streets or a few, we've got the sewers have been cleaned out. It's a totally different way of living, a different morality which has been imposed on these characters. These characters develop because of the structure of the new city. And in these last two characters that we've looked at, this person with the grotesque squatting pictures of people dancing, but particularly in Bellamy, who is a Rastignac, who will make his career out of corruption. So what is really important then is that these are medical ideas that you had at the beginning of Paris. This, Paris was dirty, it was unhygienic, people were at risk of catching cholera, typhoid, of dying from being cut down by criminals. You now have the danger is been internalised. People now are suffering from melancholy, they're suffering from alienation, they're suffering from mental illnesses, the women are suffering from hysteria. So Paris now causes this sort of degeneration in the character and in the hero. So there is really a direct influence, as I said, the better the city of Paris becomes, the more distorted the lives of the hero become. So thank you very much.